Please listen carefully.
Hi, I'm Paul Fields.
And I'm Dave Guzman.
Welcome to Practical Bass, where each week we pick a topic of interest to you, the working bass player, and we sort of take it apart, look at it from a lot of different angles, and try and expose some of the pitfalls and give you some tips to help you elevate your gigs and gear. We want you to be part of the conversation. It's not just about us talking to you. We really want to hear from our listeners. So do get in touch with us. There are many ways to do that. You can email us at podcast@practicalbass.com, or you can visit the website at practicalbass.com and leave us a comment in the feedback area. We also have a Facebook page and group, and you are welcome to come by there and join up. We'd love to hear from you there. Start a discussion, join a discussion, talk to fellow bass players about the practical aspects of being a working bassist. You'll also find us on Instagram, on Twitter, Google+, pretty much all the socials. What are we going to talk about this time out?
Yeah, I think today we're going to dive into the very practical world of contractual agreements.
Ooh, contracts.
Contracts. It's a heavy word. Contracts.
For your soul.
Forever.
Sometimes they do feel that way. Yeah. The contract issue is tricky. Like, we were talking about this before we started recording. And, one of the things that I thought to myself in, trying to write some notes and gather thoughts about this is, not to try and overstep my own experience. I've not yet been involved in a tour or a group at the level where you end up signing like a whole sheaf of agreements for, for marketing, for promotional, for, a venue chain, right? The kind of things that you're going to see for, really large scale tours. I haven't operated at that level. I'm sure there are a lot of our listeners who have not as well. So, from my end, sort of thinking about this at like the local and mid-level kind of thing where you have a one-off gig, or you might have a recurring gig at a, certain kind of venue that's maybe, more on the, 100 to 500 person type audience.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because at the end of the day, this is contracts. It is a legal topic. And, I think the more money that's involved, in the more situations that you're going to find contracts that are there. So for the most part, I think, we're just going to tackle this kind of at the weekend warrior level, kind of like we do everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, another good point, and I think you kind of were alluding to this, is that, Dave and I aren't attorneys, obviously, because, if we were, we'd have a lot more money to sink into, our equipment.
That's right. We would have a legal podcast.
Right, exactly. That would be a great podcast, man. If there are some entertainment attorneys out there, have them do a podcast. But, on the other hand, why give it away for free, right? You're getting paid to do that stuff.
Right. For bathroom breaks and everyththing.
Yeah, exactly. So, whatever you can charge to the client is good, right? But yeah, Dave and I aren't attorneys, so, we're not going to give anything that you guys should construe as legal advice. And with that out of the way, we're just going to talk about this from the performer's point of view.
Yeah.
Dave, have you ever had the issue of a contract sink a gig, right? Because like not every place is going to do contracts. Have you ever had like a time where, you're looking for a contract or whatever and bringing it up like torpedoed the gig?
Yeah, I definitely had one situation where a venue just wouldn't accept the contract that we had to offer, and we needed it because we felt sort of unsure about payment.
You were like insecure about was it someone you hadn't dealt with before, or
it was a venue that had a reputation, and we had some like verbal pieces that kind of went sideways. So I decided to put together a contract. They wouldn't accept it.
Yeah,
and the gig just never happened.
Yeah. In other words, this place might have been the kind of venue where they like to do cash under the table or whatever.
Sure.
And suddenly the idea that there's a contract with terms like spooked them.
Right.
Yeah.
And normally I don't try to push that on, and like I don't take that angle, but if there is a reason to, then I'm going to do it. And if they turn away, then it's probably all for the better.
Yeah.
Anyways, have you ever had a similar situation or anything, that impeded that?
Yeah. And it was similar to yours. I mean, this was a kind of an established place. And again, there was a reputation of, coming to them afterwards and having the outcome be different than what you signed up for.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I understand, and I'm fully on board with venues that want a certain, they want the band to do a certain amount of promotion. They want you to get people in there.
Yeah.
I am highly in agreement with that, right? If you can't do your job as a band, why would any sort of venue want to hire you on or bring you back? On the other hand, I was in a situation with a group of folks, and it was actually kind of a good ways out of town for us. And I mean, like on the order of like 120 miles away.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not like we had a lot of friends, or family or whatever, just like local people to just fill it in. We were kind of going outside our comfort zone. And this is always, it's always a hinky thing to do when you're a young band. This was wasn't when I was younger as well. You really have to conquer your area before you get out there. And we were a little maybe overambitious.
Right.
And we're going to this faraway place, and we had a verbal agreement on what our guarantee was.
Right.
Right. With a difference that would kick in if we were able to bring a certain amount of people there.
Right.
I had found out from other people that the guarantee often changed after the gig was over.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah. So that was when I tried to send in a contract, and the manager of the place that I was talking to really not just, spooked, but really took offense to it.
Right.
I got the feeling that I may have not been the first person that week to do that.
Right.
Yeah. So that didn't, yeah. That didn't go over great. But, the thing is, we ended up, I was a different kind of business person back then. We ended up taking the gig, and we ended up actually getting quite a lot of people there, and that was great, but we didn't get any calls back to that place, even after having a really good night there. And I think that the contract may have been, that may have been the thing that sealed the deal on that, which is, was too bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, and there was something in there that just made me think, when we talk about contracts, part of it is, look, a verbal contract is a contract. Yeah. Right. You can't take that off the plate. Like when we think of contracts, we think of like the actual paper document. Technically, a verbal contract or an email or whatever that communication is, those are just really kind of rough sketches, So when I think about like, if there were situations where maybe a contract went sideways, where maybe the other party didn't follow through with it. Right. I don't, that's pretty much on lock. Like that's the beauty of having a paper contract, is that it does stay, but the ones that go wrong are typically because they were like verbal contracts, because they were email maybe, or the text communication. Right.
Everybody is kind of having a different kind of communication or a different kind of conversation.
Totally. Oh, now I get the Facebook Messenger stuff too.
Yeah. And when you don't, if you're having that in several different venues, if you don't kind of seal the deal in terms of being very, very straight about what you expect, and what exactly is supposed to happen. Yeah. That's when it can get pretty difficult later to try and figure out, well, I thought the agreement was X. Yeah. Clearly the manager thought the agreement was Y, right? Which is a terrible situation to be in.
Totally, because everyone's going to assume to the benefit of themselves. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's really the only time that I've had contracts go south. Have you ever had like an actual paper contract kind of not turn out the way you expected?
I've never had a paper contract turn out that way, like a real signed agreement. Right. Never have had a problem with those. You always had the, payment was as expected.
Yep.
Everybody knew what we were doing, didn't get any problems on site, like, oh, that set wasn't long enough, or when you guys coming off break, or, it's those tend to be very by the numbers. So never had a problem with those.
Yeah.
It's, otherwise has been the issue. Have you ever had any kind of contract, like verbal, anything not honored by the other party?
Yeah. Honestly, the only time would have been on some verbal situations. Like I've definitely had, venues not, like maybe timing is different. They expected a longer set or a shorter set. I've had situations where like I've had some bad pay situations, right? And we've all had those experiences where they give you one promise, and then there's on the back end when it's chaotic and it comes time to collecting a check from somebody.
Yeah.
You don't know who. You find that person, and then they're having the discuss. They're not the decision maker, and they just have a check that's pre-written out, not for the right amount or whatever, right?
Yeah.
All these different things, and all of that is always with verbal. It's always a verbal contract.
Right. Actually, in the verbal contract, like you say, that's really the thing that you have to convert it at some point into writing, even if it's just that email or something like that, to confirm the terms.
Right.
I'm sure that legally, these different kinds of contracts have different standards of enforceability or different expectations. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but my bet is that if you have an email agreement, that's going to mean a little more than, a he said, she said, right? If you have an email, it's very clear what was agreed to. That may or may not have a better level of enforceability.
Right.
And of course, enforceability means something, right? It's like, that's assuming that you're going to do something about it if you feel like you've been slighted. And really, if you don't, then it doesn't really matter.
Right. And because again, at the level that we're looking at it, there's never going to be, I would never find myself in a situation where I'm, hiring an attorney, right, to defend a contract.
One would
that was
hope
broken.
not, right?
But
I'm sure it depends on the amount of money the contract's for, right?
Maybe.
Like, when you're talking about a $300 gig or something like that, or a $500 gig, it's a lot different than a $5,000 or $10,000 gig.
Oh, right? Yeah. I'll have my attorneys on that one.
Yeah. your team of
my
attorneys.
Team. Oh, there's plural.
The crack team of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe.
Yeah. They may or may not be licensed, but they're definitely attorneys.
They're like pit bulls.
Right. Well, but I think at the end of the day, the purpose of it, like for me, the purpose of all this is it's just a way to communicate.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. It cleans up the communication. The better the documentation of that communication, the less, the less a chance for things to go sideways.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, the verbal ones seem to be the ones that always kind of have caught me up. And I would say more often than not, managers in places, at venues that are working constantly and securing terms for different, from different suppliers, right? A band is just a supplier of entertainment.
Yeah.
Right. They're dealing with suppliers for, food, for beverages, for, all the paraphernalia that go into running a restaurant or a bar or whatever kind of venue they're running. Right. And they're used to dealing with that stuff. And I tend not to have as many issues with them. The ones that seem to fall through more for me are agreements with other talent. Like somebody is bringing me in as it's never happened. Like, for example, when I sub in for your group, never been an issue.
Right.
Ever.
Right.
There are plenty of people it's never been an issue, but there are people that I've worked for where I've come in to do an agreed on job and not, that falls through. Like suddenly, kind of forgotten when pay, when the pay comes around, like you don't ever hear back. And that can be painful. So I know people who, they'll counteract that by getting paid up front, like when they show up.
Right. Yeah. And I can always tell a difference. Like when I work with subs that do sub a lot, they're very specific on the payment process, the time that they need to be there. They're asking all those questions to iron it out, and it's all on either text or email, whatever way they communicate. And it's because Usually
Yeah.
any of these situations because people have been burned in the past, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's what creates these, processes.
And hey, here's a little shout back, right? If people are interested in that idea of like how you can be a better sub and kind of set expectations properly and deliver on them, check our back catalog, our archives on Practical Base. And we had an episode that was all about like finding a sub and how you should behave as a sub. I think we had a couple episodes on that.
Yeah.
So definitely go back and check those. We'll try and link them in the show notes also. So
yeah. And there's another episode too that we did about actual payments, like asking for money.
Yeah. All about pay.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when you're dealing with a contract situation, what do you look for in a contract that you're going to be a party to?
Yeah. So for what I'm looking at when I'm either if I'm creating a contract or if I'm looking at a contract that's being presented to me, I'm just, in general, I'm just looking for it to spell out all of the expectations from both parties. I want to know exactly what they expect of us. I want to know, what their expectations are is for the other side of the contract for them, to fulfill to us.
Right.
Right. Everything from like, do we get food? Is there a parking situation? Is there, what time do they want us to be there before, if it's an event or whatever? I want all of those line items kind of spelled out. And it's really just a way to help manage the conversation. Mm-hmm. Because if you ever talk to somebody that's like coordinating an event or someone that's managing one of these, a show, and you just start having a conversation, you start asking a lot of questions, and maybe you're getting through a full list, maybe you're not, and the contract helps really work through all of those details.
Like if that contract has like blank spaces for here's how long the performance time is, here's how long the breaks are. Of course the pay is an element of that, but then also like how much time ahead do you need to be there to set up? When all those things are kind of blank, it's a way of, not walking in and saying, this is what we're going to do, but here are the things that you and I need to decide.
Yeah.
We want the gig to be, right?
Yeah.
You have room to talk about it. It's a discussion.
Exactly.
But then once you fill it out, you've got an agreement, right?
Totally. I have a, I guess like recently, this was 2 to 3 weeks ago, we had a gig that was booked for a wedding. It was one of those we just didn't quite see coming. And then I think it was like the mother of the bride started like hitting up one of my bandmates, and he just forwarded the email to me because I think he was just looking for my like help, right?
Yeah.
Because the woman was kind of showing a bit of edginess, right? Which is normal with wedding gigs. That's
because there's so much going on.
It's all emotion. I mean, if you're into the wedding gig thing, you just, go with caution. You got to know what you're getting into. High emotions.
Step carefully, yeah.
And I spoke with the woman, and I took her from like a level 10 on her like hot level.
Yeah.
All the way down to like a 1.
Yeah.
And it's just because I said, look, I have a contract, and it's not it's not to, it is a binding contract, but it's just to help walk through all these pieces, all these questions that you have, along with a questionnaire, like a wedding questionnaire that I have. I emailed it to her, and it was just like, she was like, this is exactly what I need. Just need to know that everything's going to be cool.
Right.
And it's because it helps. She wouldn't know like what to expect, like what questions to ask. So that creates anxiety.
Yeah. And she would have seen questions on that list that, oh my gosh, yeah, this is really important, but I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
Thank goodness that we're going to talk about it. So I'm not going to get a surprise. Like she doesn't have to now remember 20 things to ask that are going to come to her one at a time over the next, month or two.
Right. And nor do I. Right.
Yeah.
And
all done for you.
And just as a kind of a pointer with this stuff too, if you're not booked with like an agency, which I don't work with an agency, but if you know someone that does work with an agency, or someone that does do a lot of these like contractual gigs, hit them up. A lot of them will give you a copy of the contracts that they use. I don't know if it's like kosher or not, but it's something, that's pretty much where I get a lot of my stuff, because you're not going to always find it on the Google machine.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And I right now am not, but in the past have worked a lot with a couple agencies around town, around the DC area.
Right.
And, I know that they deal in contracts for this stuff because those agencies are taking a part of the commission. So for them also, it's very important that they know what the terms are, because that's going to help them just, discover their cash flow over the next quarter or whatever, however many months. They're relying on that in order to understand how their business is going. That is their business.
Right.
So they're kind of taking that load off you. But then on the flip side, you don't really have to worry about negotiating the contract as much as just fulfilling your side of it.
That's right.
Right. And that's kind of the thing that they relieve you of. But yeah, absolutely. They're relying on known information to do their side of the contract work.
Right. Exactly. So when you did a lot of contract work, then like in the past, what were pieces within the contract that you would look out for that were important to you?
I mean, you really mentioned a lot of high points. So for me, I was just trying to find information around the edges that maybe doesn't occur off the bat to a listener. Something like a cancellation clause. What happens if everybody in the band is planning on a gig and then the week before your gig, the venue cancels? Right. This actually happened to me last year at a local place. And it's a pretty well-known place, and they actually pay pretty well. And they canceled on us literally a week before the gig. And that's not nearly enough time to go find a place where we could rebook. Now, if that happened 3 or 4 months ahead, that's not that big a deal. I could probably find a way to get a gig to fill that in, and I might not engage like a cancellation clause thing. But because of that, I had to kind of prevail on these folks to come through with a cancellation payment. I really think that's something important to have. Like, what if the venue burns down, a week before the gig or something like that? Or even, silly things like they double booked.
Right. More importantly,
right,
where it was like negligence, because, and you have to be flexible. Like some places, that like if it's a place that's going to get rained out, right? If it's an outdoor venue and it just gets rained out, you just have to decide what's fair, and what kind of relationship you have with that venue. Maybe you want to maybe you're open to like letting it slide, or maybe a 50% payment or whatever it is, but at least have the dialogue and have it documented. Also, if you're like, just what you're saying, like if you have subs, right, that you're pulling in for a certain gig, and they're expecting a certain pay. Now all of a sudden you have a train of like,
that's right,
sort of this chain of different people that are getting paid, and you want to make sure that you're not gonna like that they're not gonna be screwed.
And that you're not going to end up, kind of in the hole because of what happened, right? And that's really what those are about.
Good point. And
at the same time, I guess I'm not saying that, it's a major point of a contract to try and make the venue pay no matter what, because that clearly won't fly.
Right.
So, for example, in the rain date or the rained out problem, if it's an outdoor venue where they were going to make all their money from people showing up and they get rained out, there's not going to be money to pay out everybody.
Right.
And so you have to be aware of that. Sometimes you really just have to be prepared to, you're just going to take it on the chin, and there's nothing you can do about it. Typically an event like that, though, the great thing about it is you're not going to be coming in responsible for like the sound and the tech and the light and stuff like that. It's really just showing up and doing the gig, and the promoter or the event staff they're going to have to deal with each of those suppliers on their own. So I'm not saying that every cancellation means, hey, a contract is there to make sure you get paid. Like there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And if you were to try and jam a cancellation clause that was pretty unfair down a venue's throat, I would say you could count on not getting a call back after that.
Totally.
For anything else. So,
right. That's where you have to read the relationship.
Yeah. Walk softly and just know what it is that you really need.
Right.
As opposed to what you really want.
Right.
Right. So a couple other things I guess I look for, things like, some clause that says there's going to be sufficient power on site, or it doesn't need to tell you the power situation, but it has to say something to the effect of, the venue's going to have it. Right. You don't show up and find out that you needed to bring like 2 truck-sized generators with you or something like that. That there's a space to play in. That they're responsible for, not putting you in an unsafe situation.
Right.
Things like that. We talked about the time and, break time and play time.
Yep.
Sometimes if it's not a typical venue, the venue or the manager or organizer, they may have a demand for a certain kind of attire, right? Like a wedding gig,
Right.
like you guys did.
Yep.
I would not be surprised to see the wedding, that checklist of things saying, what do you want the band to wear, right? Because they're going to show up wearing shorts and flip-flops and everybody's in tuxedos. Or whatever. Could look really terrible.
Yeah, not good. Not good.
I mean, maybe you could get away with that if you're literally Jimmy Buffett showing up to a wedding. But unless you're him, right, it's not going to. Or, you can show up as Keith Richards and, you wear whatever what you want because you're Keith Richards, which in that sense.
So that's 2 people.
Why are you doing a wedding?
Right. And why are you listening to this podcast?
Right, exactly. Keith, stop bothering us. Seriously. Stop calling. I blocked your number.
Retirement's looking rough for you, man.
He's like, well, fine, then. But yeah, and there are other, I guess there are probably other things that are interesting to know based on where it is, like recordings and merch. Like, can you sell that stuff at the venue? Some places don't allow it, and it's good to know that up front, right? And a contract can help you with that. Just knowing that you're allowed to sell like your T-shirts, you're allowed to hawk your CDs or whatever.
Yeah.
I actually did play a place one time it was kind of this, it was an individually or whatever family owned place, but they were kind of like a big deal in the town that we played in.
Yeah.
And they had like their own garb, like people would come and tourists would buy their T-shirts and stuff there.
Sure. Right.
And we weren't allowed to sell T-shirts at that venue because we were competing with the venue at that point.
You were taking up their T-shirt dollars.
Yeah. So what they did tell us is, you could put them at the front with their T-shirts, and they would take a cut out of them, but they would allow you to sell through them.
Huh.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Man.
So, knowing those things, like how you're going to recognize income, and is there anything in the contract that, allows or prevents that?
Right. Yeah.
So what about, so we talked a lot about gigs. Like, this has been all about gig contracts. Right. Are there other situations that you can think of where you would want some sort of written agreement or contract?
Yeah, I think so. There's contracts all over the music industry, right? And the music, like different aspects of it. I guess just like one of them to think about that I've kind of run into is if you have like an agent that's booking you, right? Like even a local booking agent or sort of like a band manager. I had someone propose to us to manage our band at one point, and it got hairy really quick because there was no contract, right?
Yeah.
It was just sort of verbal stuff, and then all of a sudden I started to feel like this slipperiness under my feet, just a lot of kind of what we need to put in, but no promises. Like, it was all about how much they were going to get paid.
Yeah.
But there was very little commitment as to what they were going to bring to the table as a band manager.
What's your skin in the game here?
Right. Like, oh, wait a second. Are you just taxing me to play music?
Right.
And I don't think this person like went in it with bad intentions. I just think they didn't want to commit.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want to be on the hook for like, whatever certain amount of booking or whatever the case is. Work. Right. Yeah. So that's one.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many. What have you come into contact of other types of contracts?
A few things come to mind. I mean, as far as what I personally dealt with, the thing that I've looked into a little bit is, publishing and songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an expert on that by any means, but that's something that I think it's important when you start talking about a band that is, you're writing, you're recording your own music, you're selling it at gigs, you are, you're essentially you're publishing that stuff, right? I
Right.
mean, if you're smart, then you are, you're probably a member of one of the, one of the large musical organizations like an ASCAP or something like
Right.
that. And then you have to think about, who wrote these songs? Did everybody write it equally, or did
Right.
somebody bring the song in and then it was people pitched in a little bit of arrangement around it, right? Those are different situations. And even as a young band, I don't mean, necessarily young members, but as a band that is early in what it's doing, and as a bass player, you want to think about that because, if you're not bringing the song in, but yet you're contributing to what's going into that song, then, you want to be recognized for that. And it sounds far-fetched probably for people who are operating at this sort of local or regional level. But remember, all the bands that that are famous or whatever started out at that level.
Right.
At some point, they
Right.
made that jump. And if you're good at what you're doing, you want to plan for those later chances of success. And one of the ways not to have one of those arguments or a breakup in the band, as you make that transition, is for everybody to have a good agreement on the professional side of it, of who wrote the songs, what percentage of it belongs to each person, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That is in my estimation, that is probably a major cause of friction for bands that are on their way up and end up kind of like, oh, there was a falling out with so and so. My bet is that, a lot of those things, well, I mean, sometimes they're going to be personal, but sometimes they're going to be based on the fact that you don't have everyone does not have an equal understanding of how the business is going to work. And then again, it's because you had a mismatch of expectations. That's what actually ruined, the relationship.
Yeah. And because if you look at the environment of a group of musicians sort of work environment, right? Like what that looks like.
Yeah.
It's very heavily weighted on like getting together, right? Like sort of bonding at a personal level.
Right.
And then also music. The professional side is like, it's a level of conversation that is not always,
people don't always have it.
they don't have it. And it makes people uncomfortable, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, because they feel like, oh, that's the place where the art and commerce kind of like butt heads.
Right.
And the thing is, if you want to get to that next level, you really have to be able to look at both of those as contributing to, the music business. Because I mean, that's why they call it music business, not music friends.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a couple areas. Recording studio agreements, I have seen those, and basically they're like releases almost, where a guy comes in to work on a recording, and if that is really about going in and just playing an assigned part,
right,
you're not going to really expect to reap any reward out of that other than whatever you get paid for the date, and you typically sign some paperwork about that. Sometimes people come in and they create in the studio, and that's very different. That's like you would write a song anywhere else. You just happen to be doing it in a studio and paying lots of money to do it.
right.
But yeah, and you mentioned the band managers. I mean, what about labels? I mean, let's forget about major labels, because there's about 1 million things on the internet about what that can mean, pro and con. But what about like indie labels?
Yeah, I think there's, look, on the internet, there's just so much out there. And it's sometimes difficult to tell who's actually a label. Like, what are they actually going to perform for you? What are they going to do for you? Or in essence, are they just basically in some super fine print, owning your music and not giving you, any sort of flip side? Because it could just be one guy behind like a really nice polished website. Yeah.
I mean, you can pay somebody a few $100 and get a really nice website, right? Anybody can do that. Like, it's like having a nice business card.
Totally.
You just need an elegant design, and
the barrier to entry is very low.
Yeah.
Very low barrier to entry.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, it pays to look through that stuff. And I would say, again, just to kind of wrap things back around to our beginning statement, we're not attorneys, but I would say if you get to a point where you're really serious about the business and you've got somebody who is claiming to be able to give you a service and it's going to cost you a substantial amount of money, over time.
Yep.
That's the point where you really, if you don't have one, you should have an attorney at that point. You need to secure some legal representation and or a business agent of your own, and have somebody look over that who knows what the terms are going to mean and can ask you the questions about what your expectations are to help you decide whether that's a good deal or a bad deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Or if you, if you're being presented a contract or there's some fine print in something, as you're expanding and you're just not totally sure about it, because the thing about a lot of contracts is there is a lot of legal verbiage, which is not really English.
Yeah.
It's English, but
it's English, but it has a specific meaning.
Yeah. It's like it's like a coded form of English.
Yeah.
And so, you know what, just ask somebody that a friend of the family, somebody that just deals in a legal environment, and you can have them, if it's something basic, have them read over it, buy them a 6-pack.
Just to get started. Yeah.
Just so that at least you understand, or they might be able to point out, they won't give you advice, but they'll say, this is like an area that you should really think of. This seems like heavy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like there seems to be some ties in here.
If you haven't determined by that point, looking at the language, I don't get it, show it to somebody else and they're like, yeah, I don't get it either. That's a good sign.
Totally.
You really need an expert to get involved at that point. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up for this episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening a little bit about contracts and agreements and maybe how to deal with them. We'd really be interested in hearing from you guys out in the listening audience. What contracts have you dealt with? What agreements have you dealt with that have been really beneficial for you or have caused you a lot of pain? What was an adventure that you had with agreements that went south?
Adventure.
Yeah, that was a kind way of putting it, right? Yeah, we would love to hear about that. You can get in touch with us very easily. You can email us at podcast@practicalbase.com or visit the website practicalbase.com and leave us feedback. But it's also really easy to go to our Facebook page or our group, and you can start a conversation there. We would love to have you guys along for the ride and assemble a community around this podcast. A community of working bassists, I think, is a group of probably the most supportive kind of people I can imagine. So we're really aiming for that. And if you want to help be supportive of this podcast, one thing we would like you to do is share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues. When you see a notice come up for the new episodes, let people know, spread the word. We really are hoping to give something back to the musical community here, and we'd love to have you guys along for the ride. Subscribing to the podcast is really easy. You can visit the website for tips, but it really boils down to this. If you have an iPhone, just use the Podcasts app. If you have an Android device of any kind, use Google Play Music. You can use Stitcher Radio on any platform. You can use iTunes on your Mac. Just search for Practical Bass and you'll see our podcast will come up. Use the subscribe button or the subscribe link, and you're going to get a new episode delivered fresh to you each week, full of whatever latest topics come from not just me and Dave, but also from our listeners. We invite you to send us topics that you're interested in, and we would love to cover those in podcasts coming up in the future. And so subscribe and share and spread the Practical Bass love. And until next time, I'm Paul Frields.
I'm Dave Guzman.
And this has been Practical Bass.
Thanks for listening.
He came up in the search.
My mom told me if you Google it, you could trust it. So that's what I live by. This, I don't even need to read the contract. It came from Google.
It must be good.
I Googled it.
It's been Googleated. Googleized. Oh, man.
And Google just paid us 10 cents. Thank you.
Ching.
Ching.